In the early hours, the sleepy town of Circleville, Ohio, was jolted awake by the wail of fire engines racing through its streets. As dawn broke on September 15, 2023, thick plumes of black smoke billowed into the sky, marking the location of a devastating inferno that would soon expose the dark secrets lurking beneath the surface of this seemingly idyllic Midwestern community. The source of the blaze was a stately two-story colonial home on Elm Street belonging to Albert Wells, a 65-year-old retired high school principal and longtime Circleville resident. As firefighters battled the flames, neighbors gathered on the street, their faces etched with concern and morbid curiosity. Among the onlookers was Tom Dixon, also 65, Albert's next-door neighbor and purportedly his best friend. Dixon, still in his running clothes, had reportedly discovered the fire during his morning jog. His wife, Gina, 63, stood beside him, clutching his arm, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. As the flames were finally brought under control, Fire Chief emerged from the smoldering ruins, her expression grim. "We've found a body," she announced to the waiting police officers. "Male, elderly. It appears to be the homeowner, Albert Wells." Detective Jack Gordon of the Circleville Police Department took charge of the scene, his experienced eyes scanning the crowd of neighbors for any signs of suspicious behavior. Little did he know that he was about to unravel a web of deceit, betrayal, and revenge that would shake the foundations of this close-knit community. As crime scene investigators combed through the charred remains of the Wells residence, Detective Gordon began the task of interviewing witnesses. Tom Dixon, being the one who discovered the fire, was among the first to be questioned. "I was on my usual morning run," Dixon explained, his voice steady but his eyes avoiding direct contact with the detective. "When I passed Al's house, I noticed the garage door was open. That's when I saw the smoke and called 911. Gina Dixon corroborated her husband's story, stating that Tom had left for his run at his usual time of 6 a.m. He came back about 20 minutes later out of breath and frantic, saying Al's house was on fire, she recounted, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. As the day progressed, more details emerged. Albert Wells had lived alone since his wife's passing 5 years earlier. He was well-liked in the community, known for his dedication to education and his volunteer work at the local senior center. But as Detective Gordon would soon discover, beneath the veneer of small-town respectability lay a tangled web of secrets and lies that would lead to a shocking revelation about the true nature of the Circleville Inferno. 2 days after the fire, the county medical examiner, stood over the charred remains of Albert Wells in the sterile confines of the Circleville Hospital morgue. Detective Gordon watched as she meticulously examined the body, her trained eyes searching for clues that the flames might have tried to erase. "Detective," Doctor began, her voice somber. "Mr. Wells was dead before the fire started." Gordon's eyebrows shot up. "You're certain?" The medical examiner nodded, pointing to a section of the skull that had been cleaned of soot. "There's a depressed fracture here, consistent with a blunt force impact. The lack of vital response in the surrounding tissue indicates it occurred perimortem or immediately after death." She continued her explanation, detailing her findings. "There's no soot in the airways, which we'd expect to see if he had been breathing when the fire started. Blood tests also show no elevation in carbon monoxide levels." "So we're looking at a homicide," Gordon concluded grimly. "Without a doubt," Doctor confirmed. "The blow to the head was severe enough to cause unconsciousness, if not immediate death. I'd estimate the time of death to be between 5:30 and 6:30 a.m. on the morning of the fire." As Gordon jotted down notes, the medical examiner added one more crucial detail. "There's something else, Detective. I found traces of seminal fluid in the victim's mouth and on his genitals. It appears Mr. Wells was engaged in sexual activity shortly before his death." This new information added another layer of complexity to the case. Who had Albert Wells been with in his final moments? And how did that encounter lead to his brutal murder? As Gordon left the morgue, his mind raced with possibilities. The quiet town of Circleville had just become the scene of a baffling homicide, and he was determined to uncover the truth no matter where it led. With the autopsy results confirming homicide, Detective Gordon began the painstaking process of building a list of suspects. Given the early morning time frame of the murder, he focused on individuals who lived or worked near Albert Wells or who had reason to be in the vicinity of Elm Street between 5:30 and 6:30 a.m. on the day of the fire. One name quickly rose to the top of the list: Tom Dixon, Albert's next-door neighbor and the man who had discovered the fire. Gordon couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Dixon's story than met the eye. During a follow-up interview at the police station, Gordon pressed Dixon for more details about his movements on the morning of the fire. Mr. Dixon, can anyone corroborate your whereabouts between 5:30 and 6 a.m. here? Dixon shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Well, as I said before, I left for my run at 6 o'clock. My wife can confirm that. And before 6 o'clock, Gordon prodded. I was asleep, Dixon replied, a hint of defensiveness creeping into his voice. Look, Al was my best friend. Why would I want to hurt him? But as Gordon dug deeper, inconsistencies in Dixon's story began to emerge. A neighbor reported hearing raised voices coming from the direction of the Wells residence around 5:45 a.m. Another witnessed a figure that resembled Dixon entering his own home shortly before 6 a.m., contradicting his claim about when he left for his run. Furthermore, a search of Dixon's home uncovered a wrench with traces of blood hidden in the back of his garage. While DNA results were still pending, the discovery was enough to make Dixon the prime suspect in Albert Wells's murder. However, Gordon was troubled by the lack of a clear motive. Tom and Albert had been friends for decades, with no known conflicts between them. What could have driven Dixon to murder his longtime friend and neighbor? The investigation into Albert Wells's murder took an unexpected turn when 21-year-old Matthew Dixon, grandson of Tom and Gina Dixon, walked into the Circleville Police Department. His arrival sent ripples through the precinct, as officers wondered what connection the young man could have to the case. Detective Jack Gordon, seasoned by years on the force, had seen his fair share of twists and turns in homicide investigations, but nothing could have prepared him for the bombshell Matthew was about to drop. I have information about the murder, Matthew said, his voice trembling slightly as he sat across from Gordon in the interrogation room. There was an affair between my grandmother Gina and Albert Wells. Gordon's eyebrows shot up, his mind racing to process this new information. That's a serious allegation, Matthew. Are you sure about this? Matthew nodded, his eyes cast down at the table. I'm sure. I saw them together. As Matthew recounted his story, Gordon couldn't help but feel a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Why would Tom Dixon's own grandson come forward with information that could implicate his family? The detective's instincts told him there was more to this story than met the eye. News of Matthew's revelation spread quickly through the department. Officers exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others whispering theories about what this could mean for the case. The quiet town of Circleville was about to have its foundations shaken once again. Gordon wasted no time in calling Gina Dixon in for questioning. As she sat in the same chair her grandson had occupied just hours earlier, Gordon could see the nervousness etched on her face. Mrs. Dixon, Gordon began, his tone even but firm, we've received some information that suggests you had a personal relationship with Albert Wells. Is there anything you'd like to tell us about that? Gina's face paled, her hands clasping and unclasping in her lap. For a moment, she seemed ready to deny everything, but as Gordon pressed on, recounting the details Matthew had provided, the facade began to crumble. Under the weight of the evidence and her own guilt, Gina finally broke down. Tears streaming down her face, she confessed to the affair, unraveling a tale of secret trysts and hidden desires that had been simmering beneath the surface of Circleville's quiet exterior. But it was what happened on the morning of September 15th that truly shocked Detective Gordon. Gina's voice shook as she recounted the events of that fateful day. Tom was supposed to be on his morning run, she began, her words coming out in a rush. Albert and we thought we had time. We were in his garage when we heard footsteps. Gordon leaned forward, hanging on every word as Gina described the horrifying scene that unfolded. Tom Dixon, driven by a mixture of rage and betrayal, had stumbled upon his wife and his best friend in a compromising position. In a blind fury, he had grabbed the nearest object, a wrench, and struck Albert on the head with devastating force. There was so much blood, Gina whispered, her eyes haunted by the memory. Albert just collapsed. And Tom, I'd never seen him like that before. He was like a different person. As Gina continued her confession, Gordon's mind raced to connect the dots. The wrench found in Dixon's garage, the neighbor's report of raised voices. It all started to make sense, but nothing could have prepared him for what came next. Tom grabbed a gas can, Gina said, her voice barely audible. He started pouring it everywhere. I begged him to stop, but he wouldn't listen. And then... She paused, taking a shuddering breath before continuing. Matthew burst out of the closet. He'd been hiding there, watching us. Tom was so shocked that he froze for a moment. Matthew didn't say a word. He just looked at his grandfather, then at Albert's lifeless body. It was as if he already knew this would happen. Gina's confession sent a wave of shock through Detective Gordon. The image she painted of that morning was not just of a crime of passion, but a crime orchestrated by fractured relationships and festering resentment. Gordon stared at Gina, letting her words sink in. Matthew was there, watching? He asked. Gina nodded, wiping her eyes. Yes, I didn't even know he'd been hiding. He must have followed me that morning. Gordon raised his hand to stop her. Let's take a step back. Why was Matthew there? Gina hesitated. Matthew and I had been having an affair too. The detective's breath caught. With your grandson? The room fell silent, thick with tension, as if the very air had been suffocated by the gravity of what Gina was about to reveal. She couldn't bring herself to look at Gordon anymore. Her face was a canvas of guilt, shame, and exhaustion, betraying her struggle to hold it together. She was crumbling, piece by piece, under the weight of her own indiscretions. I didn't want any of this, Gina finally muttered, her voice barely audible, as if confessing would somehow strip away the last shred of dignity she had left. But after Matthew caught me with Albert months ago, everything changed. He demanded something from me, something in exchange for keeping his silence. Gordon leaned in slightly, his pen hovering just above the notepad, every word from Gina adding another layer to the story. Blackmail? He asked, his tone calm but sharp, slicing through the tension. She nodded, her weak response reflecting the helplessness that had taken hold of her. At first, I thought he'd just move on, like it was something he'd forget. But he didn't. He became obsessed. He'd show up when Tom wasn't around, making excuses just to be near me. And I felt trapped. I didn't want to hurt Tom, but I didn't know how to escape Matthew either. He was young, Gordon, really young. I think he liked the thrill of it all, the secrecy, the danger. It made him feel powerful, like he had control over everything. Gordon's brow furrowed, but he kept his composure, letting Gina continue. He started coming with us on family trips, always there, lurking in the background, finding ways to be close to me without anyone suspecting. I could feel his eyes on me, like he was always watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. She shuddered, her voice breaking. He knew he had something over me, and I think it excited him, knowing he could make me feel powerless. Gina paused, collecting herself, but the shame was too much. It wasn't even about love or passion anymore, she added softly. I wanted to feel young again. And Matthew, he was so much younger than Albert. It was like, I don't know, like I was trying to prove something to myself, that I still had it, that someone still wanted me. But that morning, everything went wrong. Gordon took in a deep breath, sensing that the darkest part of the story was yet to come. What happened that morning? Gina swallowed hard, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for a way out of her confession. Matthew followed me to Albert's house, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He must have been watching us, watching everything, waiting for the right moment. He didn't care about keeping it a secret anymore. I think he wanted Tom to find out. He wanted to destroy everything, Gordon. Gordon's pen scratched across the page as he tried to keep up with the details. His mind was racing to fit all the pieces together. So Matthew knew about your affair with Albert for months, and he was using it to manipulate you. But why didn't he say anything when Tom killed Albert? Why keep silent then? Gina's face twisted with fear, her eyes wide as though the memory of that day had come flooding back in sharp, painful detail. Matthew was scared. He thought if Tom found out, he'd kill him too. He wasn't just playing games anymore. He realized how dangerous it was. Tom wasn't the man I thought he was. When he killed Albert, Matthew panicked. He thought his life was over, that Tom would hunt him down next. Gina, Gordon said after a long pause, his voice more measured now, tell me everything, the whole truth. How did Matthew convince you to go along with this? Gina's shoulders slumped as though the last bit of resistance had finally left her. Matthew was smart. He played me, Gordon. After he found out about Albert, he pushed me. He pushed and pushed until I had no choice but to give in. One night, after Tom had left for a work trip, Matthew came over like he always did. But this time, he brought up Albert. He said that we could have more fun together. All of us. Gordon raised an eyebrow. All of you? Gina closed her eyes, her breath shaky. He suggested a three-way. He said it like it was some casual thing, like it was no big deal. I didn't want to do it, but he had all the power. He knew I was desperate to keep everything quiet. So that day it happened. We went to Albert's house and Gordon didn't need her to finish. The details were already unfolding in his mind, and the weight of it all settled in his chest like a stone. This wasn't just an affair. It was coercion, manipulation, and ultimately a chain of events that had spiraled into violence. He looked at Gina, her eyes empty and defeated. Matthew's control over you was deeper than I realized, he said quietly, and it all led to Albert's death. Gina didn't respond. She didn't need to. The truth had been spilled, and now there was no going back. Tom Dixon was arrested later that evening, charged with the murder of Albert Wells. During the trial, the details of Gina's affair with Albert and her secret relationship with Matthew came to light. The courtroom was packed with reporters and townspeople, all eager to hear the sordid details that had shattered the small town's illusion of peace and respectability. Tom's defense claimed that he had acted in a moment of temporary insanity triggered by the discovery of the affair, but the prosecution painted a different picture, one of a man who had harbored deep anger for years and finally snapped. Gina testified, reluctantly revealing the truth about her relationship with Matthew and how it had all spiraled out of control. She spoke of the years of emotional abuse from Tom, how it had pushed her toward Albert, and how Matthew's blackmail had further trapped her in a cycle of guilt and secrecy. The jury, however, was not swayed by the emotional complexities of the case. They convicted Tom of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. 5 years passed, and the Dixon family remained a shell of its former self. Gina moved away, trying to escape the scandal, but her reputation followed her wherever she went. Matthew, now in his late 20s, had left Circleville, distancing himself from the wreckage of his family's downfall. Then came the day when Justin Dixon, Tom's estranged son, walked into the state penitentiary where his father was incarcerated. His son, Matthew, had been diagnosed with leukemia and was in desperate need of a bone marrow transplant. After exhausting all other options, doctors had determined that Tom was the only viable match. Justin sat across from his father in the prison visitation room, his hands trembling as he explained the situation. "Dad, Matthew is only 26. He doesn't deserve this. You have the chance to save him." Tom looked at his son with cold, detached eyes. Prison had hardened him, stripping away whatever remnants of humanity he might have once possessed. "People die every day, Justin," Tom said, a cruel smirk forming on his lips. "I don't care." Justin's mouth fell open in shock. "He's your grandson," he pleaded. Tom leaned back in his chair, his face devoid of emotion. "Grandson or not, I'm not doing it. You know what, Justin? Maybe it's better this way. Maybe you'll finally understand what it's like to lose something you love." Justin stood up, disgusted and heartbroken. His father had always been cold, but this was something else. This was monstrous. As he turned to leave, Tom called out after him, "Don't come back, and don't bother asking me for anything ever again." Justin never saw his father again. Tom died in prison 2 years later, his body found lifeless in his cell after what appeared to be a heart attack. Few in Circleville mourned his passing, and many were relieved to see the end of a man who had torn apart so many lives. Gina continued to live in obscurity, haunted by the choices she had made. She never spoke to Matthew again after the trial, and he in turn had severed all ties with the rest of the family. Rumors circulated that Matthew had moved to a different state, changing his name and attempting to start fresh, but his dark past followed him wherever he went. In Circleville, the memory of the fire on Elm Street still lingered in the minds of its residents. The once quiet town, now forever marked by the tragedy of betrayal, murder, and a family's unraveling, had changed. Its secrets had been exposed to the world, and the people who lived there knew that they could never go back to the way things were. But even as the years passed and the town tried to move on, the story of the Circleville Inferno remained a chilling reminder of how easily love could turn to hatred, and how the darkest desires could destroy everything in their path.